Hello everyone. In this lesson, we will learn how to create our own raw JSON data that represents WordPress content. So for example, in our previous lesson, we created this new custom REST API URL, WP-JSON University v1 search. Now at the moment, it only returns a bit of sample text, right? Congratulations, you created a route. And now our goal for this lesson is to learn how to actually output useful data, right? We want to output raw JSON that represents WordPress posts and pages. Now right away, I have some good news, actually amazing news. We do not need to stress about the JSON syntax. We can simply return PHP data and WordPress will do all of the hard work for us. WordPress will automatically convert PHP data structures into valid JSON for us. Now, if everything I just said makes zero sense, that's okay because right now we're going to jump into a hands-on exercise so you can see firsthand what I'm talking about. So right now, let's jump into our text editor. And within my theme folder, I'm going to look within my INC folder, which is just a popular abbreviation for includes. And let's open up our searchroute.php file that we created in the previous lesson. Now we know that whatever this function down here returns, that's what we will receive when we send a request to this URL or route. So with that in mind, let's get rid of this temporary placeholder sample text of congratulations. And instead, just as a test, let's return a PHP array. So return, and then let's just say the word array with its own parentheses, semicolon at the end, and then in between the parentheses, maybe say red, comma, orange, comma, yellow. Now before I save this, I just want to point out that this is valid PHP code, but this is not valid JavaScript, which consequently means that this is not valid JSON in the slightest. But check this out. If I save this and refresh my custom API URL, we see that it works just fine. This is valid JSON. And that's because WordPress automatically converted PHP data into JSON data. So this means we don't need to stress about JSON syntax. We can just continue to write PHP code like we've been doing throughout the entire course, and WordPress will take care of the conversion from PHP to JSON for us. So for another quick example, instead of just a simple array, let's try to create an associative array. So let's delete this and instead return a new array. And for associative arrays, I always like to drop down to a new line. And the example I always use for an associative array is cat equals meow, dog equals bark. Now again, this is normal standard PHP code, but if you tried to run this same code, this same syntax in JavaScript, the world might come to an end, right? This is not valid JavaScript code at all. But if we go ahead and save it and refresh our new URL, we see a JavaScript object with a property named cat with a value of meow. Now you might be thinking, big deal, who cares? So it converts PHP into JSON. Why is that such a big deal? Well, the reason it's a big deal is this means we can continue to use all of WordPress's built-in functions that we've been learning about throughout this entire course. What I mean by this is you and I already know how to write custom queries to get the exact WordPress content out of the database that we want. So we can continue to write the PHP code that does that, and then WordPress will do the hard work of converting that data into JSON syntax. So let me show you what I mean. Let's give ourselves a goal. Let's imagine we want to return raw JSON data for a few of the professor posts. So let me show you how we can do that. Back in our code, let's delete this associative array and also the word return here. So now we've just got a completely blank function down here. And if we want to return JSON for professor posts, let's go ahead and create a new variable named professors. This name does not matter. I'm just choosing it because I think it makes sense. And let's set this variable to equal a new instance of the WP query class. So we've used the WP query class many times throughout the course. You might remember that within its parentheses, you just give it an array of options that describe which posts you're looking for. So let's give it an array with its own set of parentheses. Within those parentheses, let's drop down. And in this case, we only need to target one property, which is post type. And let's go ahead and set that to equal professor. All right, so now the data for the 10 most recently created professors will live within this variable. Now, throughout this entire course, our next step would usually be to loop through this collection of posts, right? So maybe down here we would say while, and just use a while loop to do something once for each post that lives within this collection. However, in this case, we don't need to do that. We don't need a while loop. We normally loop through a collection in order to generate HTML. But in this case, we don't need to generate HTML. We just need to pass on a bit of data to the REST API. So check this out. We can literally just return our professor's variable, but instead of returning this object as a whole, let's look inside it, so dash greater than, for a property named posts. This is where all of the data for the resulting posts lives. This is the data that we would usually be looping through. And a bit of a spoiler, it's just an array of objects. Each object is a post. So if we go ahead and return that, let's save this file. And then if we go and refresh our API URL, here we see data for the professor posts. It's hard to make sense of the data when it's all smooshed together like this. So if we view this same URL over in the Postman app, we can see that we're working with a JavaScript array of objects, and each object is a post. Each one has properties like an ID, an author, the body content, the title. You get the idea. Now, this is great, but we don't need all of these properties. When it comes to our search overlay, we really only need the title, the permalink, and maybe just one or two other properties. Which means there's no sense in forcing the visitors of our website to download all of this JSON data, considering we won't ever use 90% of these properties. So, back in our code, instead of returning the posts array that gets generated by our WP query, instead of returning that as a whole, which gives us all of this information we don't necessarily need, why don't we instead return an array that we build ourselves piece by piece that only contains the data that we want? So to do that, why don't we create a brand new empty array? We could name it whatever we want, but I'm going to name it Professor Results. And let's set that to equal an empty array. We will work on populating the array in just a moment, but then down here on the return line, let's just return that array. So Professor Results. Okay, so we've created a brand new empty array, and then that's what we are returning. So now all we need to do is populate this array with only the exact data that we want. And in order to do that, we are going to use our good old friend, the WordPress loop. Because we've already got this collection of posts, thanks to using WP query. So now let's just loop through this collection, but instead of outputting a bit of HTML for each item in the collection, let's instead push a little bit of data onto this empty array. Let me show you what I mean. So right below this line, let's begin a loop. Let's use a while loop. So while parentheses, curly brackets. The condition for the while loop, or how many times we want to loop, is just professors, the name of our WP query object. And you might remember from earlier in the course that this object contains a method named havePosts. So however many posts live within this collection is how many times this loop should run or repeat itself. Okay, then within the body of our while loop, within the curly brackets, remember you always want to begin the loop by saying professors, your query object, and then calling the post. We remember that this gets all of the relevant data for the current post ready and accessible. So now we can do whatever we want. And what I want to do is introduce you to a tool in PHP named ArrayPush. This function takes two arguments. So just as a placeholder, we could say A and B. And the first argument is the array that you want to add on to, which in our case is this empty array that we created up on this line. So for the first argument, let's just say professor results. Okay, and then the second argument is what you want to add on to the array. So just as an example, let's delete that placeholder and let's just add a string of text that says hello. So quotes hello. Now if I save this and then refresh Postman, we see an array with hello 3 times. And that's because we've got 3 professor posts in our collection. So this loop is just going to add a new item to this empty array each time it runs. So now all we need to do is add something that's actually useful instead of just hello. So for example, we could try to add the title of each post. So we could delete that and say, get the title, right? That's a built-in WordPress function. So we could go ahead and call that here. Save that, refresh Postman. Cool, so we see the title for each one of the 3 professor posts. However, if we stop and think about it, we don't just want a single value to represent each post. We probably want multiple properties for each post, right? The title and the permalink, and maybe the ID. So back in our code, for this second argument, let's do this. Let's get rid of get the title, and instead of just adding a single simple value here, let's add an array. So this is sort of array inception. Each time our loop code runs, we want to add a new array within the overall empty array. Now within this array that we want to add, let's drop down within the parentheses and let's just build out an associative array. Now we can make up whatever property names we want, but just as an example, let's say we want there to be a property named title. So we just set that to equal get the title. Then we could add another property, so comma, and then we could make up whatever property name we want. Let's say we want to output the permalink. So we could call the property URL or link or permalink. Doesn't matter. You can make up whatever you want. But what does matter is we want to set it to equal the results of a WordPress function named getThePermalink. All right, so now the array that we are returning to the REST API, within that array will be 3 mini arrays that each contain a title and a permalink. So if we save this and then refresh Postman, perfect. We've now got an array of 3 objects, and each object contains a title and a permalink. So this means that we now have a general idea of how to build our own custom array that contains only the exact data that we want. Now at this point, let's change gears a bit. Let's focus on the entire reason we are building this new URL in the first place, and that is to power our live search overlay. Now at the moment, we are just returning the 10 most recent professors, or in my case, since I don't even have a full 10, I'm just returning all of my professors. So Dr. Froggerson, Dr. Barks-a-lot, and Dr. Meows-a-lot. But what if someone used our search overlay to search for Barks-a-lot? Well, in that case, we wouldn't want to return all professor posts. We would only want to return this one post that contains the phrase Barks-a-lot. And as you might have guessed, that's exactly what we're going to learn how to set up in code in our next lesson. Let's keep things rolling, and I will see you then.